CDTV repairs are the order of the day today. Hello cave dwellers, welcome into the cave for part 2 of our Trash to Treasure series. If you haven't already watched part 1, which featured Gail Wellington, former Commodore employee, introducing us to the CDTV, telling us the background of the machine, then please click on the link, go and watch part 1 and you can come right back here and continue in part 2. We also got to see what the problem was with this machine, namely here with the CD-ROM, it just would not spin in part 1. Everything else on the surface seemed to be okay. It booted up, we got the splash screen, just problems with that CD drive. So we're going to get stuck straight into that right now. And we're also going to hear from an Amiga game developer from back in the day who was invited to look behind closed doors at the CDTV. And we'll hear his memories of the machine from a developer's perspective. Right, let's start with the repairs then. And let's see if we can figure out how to take this thing apart. And just before we open that box, I must say a big thank you to monsterjoysticks.com, purveyors of not just joysticks, but also adapters and everything you need to game on both modern and retro systems with your ideal choice of joystick. And of course, they've got their own fabulous joystick range. Check them out, monsterjoysticks.com. And oneclickprint.com. Whatever you need your photo printed on, whether it's as a glossy poster, on a mug, on a metal sign, they can print on just about everything and they deliver globally. So my first suspicion as to why there was no movement at all from the CD was power. Is the CD drive getting 12 volts or is it getting 12 volts but is that dropping off of a cliff when it tries to spring into action, which could signify that our PSU is failing. The meter shows a steady 12 volts with no CD in the drive, so we're at least getting that line to the system. But then when I popped a CD in, the CD of course in a caddy, there was no change. So the PSU is looking okay at this point. Now there was a lot of chatter about the caddy in the comments section in part 1 of this series, and the general consensus was that they existed to protect CDs. The caddy was apparently designed to be cheap enough so that you could buy many caddies and then you never have to take your CDs out of them. And I can see that being useful in a school environment, which is where I first came across them. So we'll need to inspect deeper now, and that means disassembling the CDTV, which, well, it's not super tricky, but you'll want to keep track of where all of the things plug back in, where the various screws go, as it's a little bit more complex than other systems, especially when you get to the CD drive itself. There are lots of power leads to come out, and then at the front of the case, you have a couple of connectors with identical size and coloured cables, so I put a dot on them, on the connector and the cable with a Sharpie, just to help identify where to put them back in, because if I take a guess, I just know I'll get it wrong. Now here's something that trips people up, and I know because I was one of those people. These 3 cables connect up the front LCD display and the infrared receiver to the system board, and you'll see tutorials where people take the cover off and then run a screwdriver along it to release the cable, like this, as I began to do before I was enlightened. But the connector is designed to be pushed down. That causes the grip on the wires to be released and you can lift the cable out. However, once they're out, sometimes they just don't go back in reliably. They sometimes don't grip as tightly as before, and the cable itself can perish, which is why a kit exists to replace them with a new ribbon cable. A kit that I do have, so if we run into some problems I can pop them in later, or if not, it's a really good spare part to have for any CDTV owner. Next up, the TV modulator slides out. If we didn't take that out, it would obstruct the removal of the main board. And then that main board can lift out. And if I just flip it over, you can then see those ports. You can see the port that the TV modulator and then the optional SCSI card slots right into. I like that. That's a neat little expansion system for a machine that's kind of tight on space. You can see the holes there that they poke through. That's on the CD drive cover. And then the expansion cards slot in nice and easily from the back. Other things that you'll notice are the memory card reader at the front of the device, which has its own ribbon cable. That can stay in place. I don't need to take that out. And then that MIDI board I mentioned earlier is at the rear of the case. Here is that board. So we have a MIDI capability, and while I don't think I'll get much use of that, I can see that Commodore were perhaps thinking of different markets, perhaps trying to get into the Japanese market where MIDI karaoke systems were quite popular at the time. So I can see their thinking there. Now how the devil do we get access to the CD-ROM drive? Well, the whole unit lifts out here, but it's still entombed in this metal casing. So we can't do anything useful with it yet. But there are a plethora of patch wires that you can see on the bottom of the PCB here, and they're installed from the factory. That hasn't been done post-sale. I understand that this is not an IDE drive, nor is it a SCSI drive technically. It's kind of halfway between them somewhere, and it's all bodged together by Commodore, which seems odd, but remember, this is 1991. It's the very early days of CD-ROMs appearing in systems as standard, so Commodore have done whatever they need to do to get this working within budget. And the result is a CD-ROM drive that's not standard, and if you can't get it working, well, you're in trouble. It's very hard to find a replacement. Now, getting into the CD drive continues to be tricky, and chatting to the community, I understand this is par for the course. 2 of the casing screws just did not want to budge to let me in. It wouldn't come out with a screwdriver, WD-40 and a bit of wiggling wouldn't shift it. Tapping it with a hammer to try and get that screw moving on the thread, that didn't work. I even waved a heat gun around for a bit just to try and cause expansion and get it to release. Nothing would move it, so in the end I found a bit that I thought was snug enough not to round off the screw, and then I did hit it with the drill, and thankfully that brute force got it loose and I didn't round off the screw, so it's usable again, but just be aware of that. There were plenty of just walk away, Neil, before you damage it moments at this stage, and lots of cups of tea. Finally, there are 6 screws to release the inner cover, and now we can see the CD-ROM mechanism. And on that cover is a spring-loaded brush, which it has the job of brushing the optical lens every time you take a CD out of the drive. That just springs back and brushes gently across the lens. So first impressions are that it's pretty clean, just like the rest of the system. The rails don't appear to be gunked up with grease. There are no physical obstructions causing problems in here. And after further disassembly, if I lay it all out on the table here, we can see all of the components that make up the CD drive. Now, when you compare this to other units of the period, the Sega Mega CD, and before it, the PC Engine CD-ROM, well, there's an awful lot of casing on it. I'm glad not all CD-based systems are entombed quite like this. Aside from the laser assembly, there's a little switch here you should be aware of. This is something to look out for. This is pressed when the caddy is in the drive, and it causes the drive to jump into life, as it now knows that a CD is present. So sometimes this isn't working and this needs a clean with some contact cleaner to get it working again. Our fix is not that simple, unfortunately. Our switch is just fine. Looking at the motor, the worm screw, that's not gunked up with grease, that's fine. So let's power it up again and we'll see if there's any life that we couldn't see from earlier testing now we've exposed all of its innards. So here we are testing it. The drive is plugged in with some foam under the laser assembly to stop me from shorting anything out on the board. And if I press that switch to indicate a CD is in the drive, there is some movement when I release it. It's as if the mechanism is trying to spin up, but it's just not managing to, and then when I release the switch, any tension from the motor trying to turn it is released, and it just kind of jiggles freely. Likewise, there's some very slow movement on the sled, which trundles in a very pedestrian fashion towards the centre of the CD, and then the lens goes up and down as it tries to focus on a CD that's not there. Voltages throughout this testing remain solid going into the CD drive. So what does this evidence tell us? Well, it tells me that it seems to be mechanically sound, it's just moving very, very slowly. It suggests to me that there's too much resistance somewhere on the board, and that is a symptom of a failing capacitor. The capacitor has perhaps failed in such a way that its resistance has gone very high, and it's just not letting enough juice through to power the motor to get things moving. There's only one way to prove that theory, at least with the tools that I have, and that's to remove the capacitors, get them out of the circuit and test them, and we can see if we can identify the failed ones. And in doing so, well, we might as well just replace them all with new ones as they're coming off anyway.
So we found that some of the 10 microfarad 16 volt capacitors were actually bad. And by bad I mean some of them were so resistive they wouldn't actually test on the ESR meter. One of the problems you get with old capacitors is they become resistive to the flow of electricity. Now, you can't measure this kind of resistance with a normal multimeter because it's a kind of a phenomenon that builds up within the layers of the electrolytic capacitor. But an ESR meter can measure this cumulative resistance as it builds up in the component, and it can be shown on a meter such as this. Some of them were so bad that they had resistance in the range of 40 ohms. And some of them were okay, borderline, but still had resistance in the range of around 3 ohms, which would be functional, but obviously on the way out.
Mark's done a great job there, but the CD drive wants to be as tricky to put back together as it was to take apart, even more so in fact because a few of the caps that we used are just a millimetre or half a millimetre too large to fit back into the casing. It's incredibly frustrating, but we've been patient with this thing so far. So I charged up the teapot again and we allowed some additional leads on the capacitors so that we could lay them down and clear any obstructions. It's a problem that could have been avoided. It's a lesson learned and it's a disaster averted. Time now to put it all back together for testing and we'll see if our CD-ROM drive is now working. Thank you so much to Mark for his work on recapping that. It's really nice when you find something conclusive like that. 3 capacitors were found with his meter to be faulty, and there was definitely a problem there. Is it the problem though? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's slip the CD in, let's turn it on and see if that thing spins, and we'll do that right now. The CD I've got here is the Welcome to CDTV. It's like a tour CD that comes with it. I'm not expecting great things from it. We'll leave it out when we first turn it on. And that should take us to the splash screen. There it is. And here's the moment of truth. Put the CD in. Now, promisingly, I'm hearing movement and the screen's gone black. That's brilliant. We didn't get that far before I can see the CD spinning. It's actually working. But I'm just listening now for any read errors, any retries. Is that laser scanning back and forward over the same parts to try and read, or is it successfully reading? It's a single speed CD drive, so I'm not expecting things to happen quickly, but we've got the Amiga mouse cursor up there, so it is progressing. And we're treated to some entertainment while it loads. Wow, this really is quite slow at loading, but again, I'm not hearing too much motion in terms of retrying to read the same parts of the disc. It's just spinning, and it is still spinning, isn't it? It is still spinning. It's quite quiet actually once it's underway. And there we are, we're at the main menu of the welcome disc, which I can't actually do anything with because I haven't wired in these, which means the IR sensor isn't working, so I can't use the controller to change the options there. So what a result, we've come a lot further than we were in part 2. We've got that CD working, and I hope you'll join me in part 3 when I'm going to apply lots of upgrades to this machine. I'm going to try and turn it, I don't know what it's doing there, I'm going to try and turn this into my ultimate CDTV using fairly period authentic upgrades. I'm not going to go overboard with modern day upgrades. We'll see what we can get hold of because parts are quite rare for this. I may well replace the connectors and the ribbons here because it would be nice to have easier access to them for future maintenance. And we'll see what else we can find out about this machine. A machine which Commodore did rename to the Commodore Amiga CDTV, having resisted attaching the Amiga name to it at first. They then went on to release a keyboard and a mouse pack for it, and I do have that coming for part 3, so we can see the second phase, if you like, of the CDTV, when it went from being a set-top box to being pushed as an Amiga with all the peripherals to turn it into a desktop computer, and we'll see how that looks and how that operates. We'll also talk about the unreleased CDTV 2, and we'll talk about the demise of the CDTV. We'll hear more from Jane and from Gail on their thoughts as to why this thing failed commercially. I hope you'll all join me for that episode. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.